we've had some pretty heady conversations today about some pretty intense topics. So I'm going to lighten the mood this afternoon by talking about disasters. And specifically, media inequity around how we find out about disasters around the world. I was at MIT Media Lab and working in a group there called Center for Civic Media that sort of unpacks and quantifies media attention. And I got fascinated with the link between aid and our attention to certain crises. And it's probably self-explanatory, but it's been a rough couple of years for crises. Humanitarian groups have found that there have been more crises of greater intensity, that more are likely on the way, more people's lives are being affected. My dad subscribes to multiple daily newspapers, and he recently told me that he stopped reading the international sections. I said, Dad, there's important stuff in there. Why are you no longer reading the international section? And he said, well, it's always depressing. And the studies I've read bear him out. It's important, but it's sad news. But over on the brighter side of things, I think there's a lot more we can do to help these days than in the past. A lot of the 20th century, we could basically send money to groups like the Red Cross, or we could show up in person, which groups like the Red Cross hate when we do. But technology is really empowering individuals in new ways. And it's also moving a lot of our jobs online. So many of the professional skills we have, we can actually give remotely now in ways that we couldn't before. And I'll get into that in a minute. But basically, we're seeing online volunteers helping disaster-affected communities in a much more direct way than they used to. We're seeing people crowdsource information into crisis maps. We're seeing people code custom projects. And we're seeing people tell the stories that need to be told. And so this might be obvious on one hand, we need to know about something exists before we can help out. But it's also been quantified. So there's a great study called News Droughts, News Floods, and US Disaster Aid by Eisenstein and Stromberg, where they actually quantified the link between a disaster being on the US televised news and whether or not the US sends formal aid money. The big disasters will get covered regardless, but for the disasters that are pretty big, it can depend what's on the news that day. And they actually empirically showed that when the Olympics are on TV, that takes up the time in the newscast that a disaster might have received. And that disaster is less likely to receive US aid money. And so that's a TV news example, but I think it probably applies to other cases too, where the more we see something in the news, the more we see something online, the more attention we pay to it, the more aid is likely to result. And so, thank you for the gift of your attention this afternoon. Fortunately for you, it's only 18 minutes, but your attention is valuable. And this economist Herbert Simon posited a few decades ago, before technology really ran away with this idea, that in post-industrial societies, where a lot of our material needs have already been met, attention and people's time becomes the really scarce resource. And scarce resources become valuable. So when we think about attention, there's entire industries. We have public relations, we have advertising. They're entirely based on the national resource of your eyeballs and attention span. And so I started thinking about this word newsworthy, which is usually one word, but I'd like to insert a little space back into it. Because I started thinking, news and worthy, what makes one lost human life worthy of telling everyone? And what makes one human life not worthy of telling anyone? And it turns out that the media system that we rely on to get us our news isn't perfect. It has some biases, as you might expect. There's formulas behind this. There's theories. Back in 1965, Johann Galtung and Marie Rouge put together 12 hypotheses of what makes something likely to get in the news or not, and specifically with international news. And these theories will probably line up with what you've seen in your life. When something happens to an elite actor, like a prime minister or a president, that's going to make the news if they stub their toe, no matter how little it is. Things that are photogenic, things that happen in rich nations, things that happen in a short time span that fit the news cycle. Climate change is really hard to cover because it's a slow burn rather than this daily event. So if Prince Harry crashes into a large photogenic cake at a charity gala in Paris, that's going to make the news. That'll run. But in other places, it's less likely. So I was at the Boston Marathon when the bombing happened, and I was traumatized. But that same week, people were upset with all the media coverage it generated because while 3 people died and many were injured at the Boston Marathon bombing, that same week in Iraq, 42 people died from a wave of bombings. And that same week in China, nearly 200 people died in a rural area when an earthquake happened. And so I'll let you guess which one got the most media coverage. It was the unexpected event, acute crisis in a globally rich place where we didn't really see it coming, the Boston Marathon bombing. And so those are some of the theories that predict the inequality of media. There's also observed results that are a little stunning. The same News Droughts, News Floods study did the math and empirically showed that where you are matters. For every 1 person that dies of a disaster in Eastern Europe, 40 people would need to die in Africa of the same magnitude of disaster to receive the same probability of news coverage. And what happens matters. So volcanoes are really big in the news. And for every 1 person that dies from a volcano eruption, 40,000 would need to die from a drought to receive the same probability of news coverage. Now, the good news is that while the media system and how it handles our attention is low broken, the whole journalism system is entirely broken. So within this, there's a lot of opportunity. Things are shifting in new ways. Even if we are in Africa, even if we don't have access to an active volcano, there are new ways to insert ourselves into the media than ever before. Some of the biggest stories of the past couple of years are stories that Galtung's theories predict would not be newsworthy. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, these stories of black boys being shot in really places that the media doesn't pay a lot of attention to would not traditionally be huge news stories. But now we've got what Jay Rosen calls the people formerly known as the audience, and we use the internet and we can insert ourselves and we can say, hey, look, this is a story. Let's linger on this a minute longer. This is actually really important to society, and these stories are getting huge. A provincial warlord in West Africa would not have been news, according to Galtung's theories. But then a couple of people skilled in documentary trade, documentarians, worked with the best hype team ever assembled, which is internet teenagers, and branded him as Kony 2012. Got the whole world paying attention. And so if we stay ahead of the curve, if we see the disorder, we can actually break through in new ways. And so basically what I want to argue is a lot of, especially those of us who are online every day we're dealing in attention-driving tasks. We're building social media audiences, we're producing visual content that spreads really well, we're writing opinion pieces and essays that galvanize other people, we're online organizing. Researchers at the Digital Media Learning Network went into completely apolitical online forums, like sports forums, and found teenagers building the social capital and organizing skills they needed to basically activate their peers to act when they were confronted by things they cared about. So even when we don't think of it in political lens, we're learning the skills necessary to move people. And so some of my favorite examples of these attention interventions that people are doing are groups like Global Voices and Translators Without Borders, where you have people with really valuable language skills. And they're actually working fewer hours at their day job so they can volunteer to translate media pieces and blog posts to get them a wider audience across different language barriers. You're seeing groups like Harry Potter Alliance, which leverage pop culture, hijack pop culture, and use people's fandom to drive them towards issues that need attention. You're seeing individuals, celebrities like George Takei, who built these massive online followings and drive them to issues that need attention. So across the board, you're seeing a lot of really creative stuff be done with these digital skills that work online. And the internet's this unique medium that rewards storytelling, that rewards visual content, and we all have a part to play there. So 2 homework assignments. The first is that if attention and the channels of attention are really important, we should learn how those channels work. It behooves us really to know why a message spreads. TED's whole motto, ideas worth spreading, which ideas spread and why. And I like to borrow from people who are smarter than I am, so I'm going to give you the names of some researchers who are looking at these questions. Guys like Gilad Lotan, Ethan Zuckerman, Hal Roberts and the Media Cloud team at Harvard. They're using network analysis to look at a single story or a single idea and see how it takes off across society. Who is spreading it and amplifying this story? Who's helping it jump from one network to another as a bridge figure, maybe the translators. And also, how are they framing the story that sort of sets the boundaries of how we discuss an issue? What words are they using? So we can actually work backwards and reverse engineer really popular, successful stories that we're all paying attention to and figure out why we're all paying attention to it. And so as we learn how stories spread, we can actually shape how stories spread and increase the success and bring the spotlight towards the stories that need them. And so the second thing you can do, which is much more powerful than studying, is making. I would encourage you to try a lot of things, to experiment and learn from the experiments and see what sticks. But the very act of trying to get a story to take off inherently involves other people. So you're going to want to coordinate with a network. See if you can, if you're from a place that doesn't get much media coverage or much positive media coverage, what can you do when you actually work together and use your own voice rather than rely on the traditional voices that are heard? And basically, I'm wondering what it would look like if all of us used our networks and our attention-grabbing skills and our positions of power or reach or whatever voice we do have together to nudge the spotlight towards the people, places, and events that need the illumination. So thank you for your attention.